What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are finally wrapping up Ultimatum. We're finally wrapping up the Ultimatum story, and I'm pretty excited about this. It's a 5-issue story, and it's one of the coolest things. Ultimatum's pretty damn solid. Again, I like it. I know it, like, people it really split the community, because a lot of people were just kind of like, man, this is crazy. And maybe the reason why, because I know some of you guys are just kind of like, this story's amazing. And maybe it's one of those things where you kind of have to have read the Ultimate Universe in its entirety up to this point in order to really understand, or at the very least, Ultimate X-Men, in order to really understand how it kind of went off the rails. But again, I don't really think it did. I think it was a story that was just really interesting and really, really fun. But still, so we're at this point now, really at the end, where like everybody confronts Magneto, right? Like that was the whole idea. It was Magneto versus the Marvel Universe. The idea that Magneto had taken the Thor hammer, he uses his control over magnetism and reversed the Earth's magnetic poles and just set in motion like this catastrophe that basically wiped out like millions and millions of people. It was humans, it was mutants, it was heroes, villains, the whole 9 yards. I mean, it was everything. Like literally just like millions and millions of people died. And so with the X-Men showing up and responding, this is one of the funny things. This is really more of a tribute to Fatal Attractions. And that's one of the things to bear in mind here. When it comes to the Ultimate Universe, because of the fact that you're talking about a new line basically of Marvel Comics that had been launched off the back of what had basically been like 50 years of comic book storytelling, you'd be hard pressed to tell a story that hadn't been told before. And so it was basically going through and just kind of like reworking existing ideas and then modifying them in a way that made sense. When it came to Fatal Attractions, it was this concept that really Magneto had created a kind of citadel, out in space, and that mutants could take up residence on it and leave the planet Earth. Well, the problem with this was that in the Fatal Attraction story, humanity thought that Magneto was essentially mobilizing an army. And so the idea was that they went to go kind of launch the first strike, at least if I remember correctly. Maybe it was Fabian Cortez who did it. But anyway, it was essentially Magneto who had blanketed the Earth in an EMP and took down power to everything. That led to the X-Men responding. Wolverine jumped in and had the adamantium stripped off of his body, and then he went forward as feral Wolverine, where we learned his claws were bone for the first time. This is very reminiscent of that. This is very much a throwback to that in the sense that Wolverine jumps in and tries to kill Magneto. The problem with this is that, remember, this is Magneto. This is one of the coolest things about this story. In any given circumstance, it probably would have just been Magneto, like, ripping the adamantium out of his body. It would have been very easy to do that. Or taking like some pipe somewhere and wrapping it around Wolverine and just throwing him out of the citadel or whatever the case may be. Instead, what he does here is he actually seizes control of Iron Man and Cyclops. And it's one of the coolest things because you're talking about men who are basically using metal. And so what Magneto does is he forces the visor of Cyclops open, and then he forces Iron Man to shoot his repulsor blast. And by being hit with both forms of energy at the same time, it literally overwhelms Wolverine to the point that he actually just is totally incinerated. Now again, this is one thing to bear in mind when it comes to Wolverine's healing factor. It's very inconsistent in Marvel Comics. Wolverine's one of those characters where how fast he can heal and what he can heal from is relative to the story that's being told. For example, if you go and you read Chris Claremont's Days of Future Past from Uncanny X-Men 141 and 142, then like Wolverine was killed when he was incinerated by a Sentinel and all that was left was his adamantium skeleton, and that was the end of him. But if you go back and you read like Civil War, it's really the Wolverine tie-in for Civil War, when he's tracking down Nitro and Nitro explodes on Wolverine and like burns him all the way down to his adamantium skeleton, Wolverine heals from it. So his healing factor is very inconsistent. But one thing to also keep in mind is in the Ultimate Universe, Wolverine's not nearly as powerful or as capable as his main Marvel counterpart, meaning adamantium is not as durable in the Ultimate Universe as it is in the main Marvel Universe, and Wolverine's healing factor is a lot more toned down. The fact remains here that, when you have the X-Men trying to take out like Iron Man and Cyclops, really subdue them more than outright destroy them, in his last few moments, Wolverine manages to like impale Magneto, which in turn leads to Magneto stripping all the adamantium off of Wolverine's body. And again, this is where things begin to sort of differ a little bit. The adamantium being yanked off his body like that, it's enough to destroy Wolverine in his entirety. That's it, because all that's left is bone. I mean, literally, like he had a little bit of flesh there, but with the adamantium being pulled off, whatever flesh was there comes with it. So it's literally just bone and sinew, and that's the end of him. And things get pretty intense here, because at this moment, what you do is you switch over to the Incredible Hulk and Colossus. Now, this is actually a pretty smart move on behalf of Marvel in terms of how they did this. And the reason why is because the Incredible Hulk, even in the Ultimate Universe, is still a pretty significant force to reckon with. And it's one of these things where, like, if the Hulk had been there alongside the other Avengers and even the X-Men to face off against Magneto, the fight would not have lasted very long, and he probably would have eaten him. But by taking him out of the equation, giving him a more reasonable task and saying the Incredible Hulk and Colossus's job is to destroy the engines powering the Citadel that Magneto is using, they still serve a purpose. They're still part of the story, but it's not so much that it's just like, but why don't they just fix everything? Why doesn't Hulk just kill Magneto? I mean, it's a pretty effective thing. But from there, you actually end up picking up with Mystique, who attacks the two of them. And then, of course, the Incredible Hulk turns around and says, it's time to eat Mystique. So, of course, Sabretooth jumps in, rescues Mystique, and they essentially bail out. But again, it's kind of cool here because at this moment, this is when you pick up with Nick Fury. And what happens is Nick Fury sits down with Magneto and says, you've been operating under false pretenses this entire time. You're operating under the premise that mutants are divine, that they were basically created by God, and that mutants should rise to power and take their rightful place. And Nick Fury's response is, you have no idea what's actually going on. So what Jean Grey does is she serves as a kind of intermediary. She basically links the minds of Magneto and Nick Fury. And this is when Magneto learns, and in fact, this is actually when we as the reader learn that mutants were basically created. That mutants were created when the gene of Logan was discovered, that if it was activated, he got a healing factor. That chemical was synthesized and spread throughout the world. And that's where mutants came from. So again, for Magneto, it's a crushing experience, or really a crushing revelation, because what it means is he's been killing his own people. Because again, it's like the Terrigen Mist. So it's like, you know, the genes are activated, some have not been activated, some have. And so he destroyed potential mutants that exist out there. And so it's a pretty crushing thing to have to come to grips with. But the fact that Magneto recognizes this means that there could have been a whole new proliferation of mutants, and he actually could have taken things in a different direction. Now, in truth, he probably would have taken them in the same violent direction. It would have been more of like an insurrection or like an uprising of the mutant population against humanity in its entirety. But he's basically forced to accept the fact that he's been killing his own people, which is like the one thing he never wanted to do. And so in light of this, the statement's kind of made, look, you know, you'll never be forgiven for what you've done. You know, and initially, like, Magneto's almost in a state of like insanity, right? Because he's just kind of like, you know, Charles will understand, Charles will forgive me, Charles will, you know, he'll understand what I meant here. And the response to Cyclops is, Charles Xavier's dead, you killed him, no one's going to forgive you. The world will never forget. And in this moment, he incinerates the entire head of Magneto using his optic beam. So again, it's pretty wild here. I mean, it's a pretty crazy ending to what I always thought was a pretty cool story. But at this point, what we do is we pick up outside the US Capitol building, and we basically kind of switch over to the aftermath of the events of Ultimatum. Now, for those of you guys who really have been reading, like, you know, Ultimate Spider-Man or something like that, and you sort of cross this moment where mutants were suddenly hated, this is the reason why. Is because this event basically initiated this massive cataclysm that almost destroyed the whole of humanity. And so because of this, humans have now switched to viewing mutants as a credible threat. And again, that's kind of the MO of mutants, right? Like, mutants were always the group, they're always the kind of like the outcasts, the ones who were never accepted by humanity. By whatever manner and whatever means, humanity rose to hate them. And so it was only a matter of time before you really switched to like full-on hatred of mutants. But when you have Cyclops up here talking to people, it's kind of interesting because what the government's considering doing is basically, you know, kind of implementing the Mutant Registration Act. And that's kind of the cool thing, is because remember, Chris Claremont created the Mutant Registration Act way back in the day, way back in like the late 70s and the early 80s. And the idea of the Mutant Registration Act was the government, really, you know, Project Wide Awake, responding to the rise in the mutant population and trying to find a way to control and contain. That was the whole, you know, the whole idea behind it. And so it really kind of seems to be this cycle repeating itself here in the Ultimate Universe. The difference is that in this speech that Cyclops makes to humanity, really trying to appeal to humanity's better side and say, look, do not turn us over to the government. Do not allow the government to pass a bill that will make us register. He's assassinated. He's shot in the head. And it's just kind of like, wow. So I mean, it's literally the worst case scenario for the mutant population because everything's in disarray. Everything is basically crumbled. It's all over the place. And so we kind of switch over for a second, you know, switch over to an aside where we end up having Dr. Doom. And remember, Dr. Doom is believed to have been the one that set all this in motion, right? He was the guy, the hidden hand behind it all. And so where he does have Name of the Submariner captive, he's suddenly met by the arrival of Ben Grimm. But remember, Ben Grimm in the Ultimate Universe is very, very hardcore in comparison to his main Marvel counterpart. He pulls no punches. And so where he comes walking in here, his whole thing is like, you have to pay for the things you've done. And where Doom is sort of haughty here, remember, this is not main Marvel Universe Dr. Doom. He's nowhere near as powerful. And so where he goes to challenge Ben Grimm crushes the skull. He literally kills him. And so it's just like, it's like, God, like, it's literally wrapping up all loose ends. And that's why Ultimatum was a story where it was kind of divisive, because people looked at it and they said, but like, they seem to be killing people for no real reason. And then other people said, but it's kind of cool though, because now you get a shift in the status quo. So again, sort of bouncing around, fluctuating, changing, different things like that. And so what we end up doing is picking up in the aftermath, kind of the epilogue for this whole thing. And we end up finding out that the person who assassinated Cyclops was actually Pietro Maximoff himself, that he used his super speed speed sent the bullet flying at Cyclops, and that's what killed him. But the idea here is that Pietro and Wanda seem to have basically survived. And the idea was that they have always been this vindictive. They've always been this dark, and they were trying to push Magneto into the direction of becoming as dark as them as well. The difference is that he never really wanted to do it that way. With them, they wanted to take a far more dictatorial approach, really more like the Mutant Liberation Front. For those of you guys who are familiar with the old X-Force comics by Rob Liefeld, that's really more the stance they were looking to take, something more heavy-handed, something more extreme. And because they consider Magneto to be weaker, the entire idea of him being assassinated, the entire idea of Pietro, Scarlet Witch, of them being taken out was all a ruse to lead Magneto down this path so that Magneto would inevitably face off against the Avengers and X-Men, would either win or lose, but regardless, it would set the stage for Pietro and Wanda to rise to power and then initiate their own campaign. So it's patricide, basically. It's pretty intense. But again, it goes forward with a whole new status quo for the Ultimates and for Ultimate X-Men and the whole 9 yards. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.